here's my hot take on how you can add your own training data or knowledge to an AI API call. And I'm going to be using the OpenAI documentation here, but it's very similar and transferable across whether you're using OpenAI or you're using Anthropic by Claude. So imagine you're building an app. For me, I work with a lot of people who are building Bubble.io apps, which is a no-code platform. And if you want to accelerate that progress, become a member. There's a link down in the description, because we've basically done this. We've custom trained, I'm going to explain our process in a little bit. We've custom trained an AI that searches through coming up to 600 video transcripts that we produced over the years so that you get the right answer to your question fast. And it was building that I learned all this, and I'm going to share that with you now. So I would say the first thing, the simplest thing, especially with an MVP, is that you use what used to be called the system prompt, then was called the developer prompt, and is now called instructions, at least with OpenAI, but again, it slightly varies across different platforms. And this is going to be part of the tokens that are sent over every single time a user engages with this conversation that you've set up, or every single time they send a request to get a response from this API that you're setting up. And so that means that if you were to paste in, a chapter of a book, that could potentially get quite expensive, because that is going to go towards your token count every single time. But of course, the cost is going to vary depending on what model you use. It's also going to impact speed of the response, because the AI is having to process all of that data each time. Now, it's slightly improve that, because again, different AI platforms offer different modes of caching. And so you might, for example, Claude's got an example of sending over a whole Jane Austen novel and caching that, because you're then preparing the model to accept more questions about that novel without having to process the whole novel again. The main rule I'd say is that you use your instruction / developer / system part of your call if you think this is data that is relevant every single time. So for example, setting up the role, setting up the tone, setting up maybe background information about the user, inserting that dynamically into your prompt. If you want to learn more about prompt engineering, my favorite tool at the moment is Portkey. We've done a couple of videos on that, where you can basically build a template and insert dynamic data in. Although I have just seen that OpenAI have now basically built their own template builder, which you can insert dynamic data into. So yeah, if it is needed, and you think it's needed to be considered in your output, for producing output every single time, I would use the instruction / system / develop part of the prompt. Now, if you think, for example, us with all of our tutorials, we don't need to submit all of our tutorials into the API call each time. We could potentially, because context windows have got so large now, but it would be very costly for us, and there will be a lot of data that's being processed by the AI that simply isn't needed. Someone asks, how do I use repeating groups? We don't need to be returning data about OpenAI's API. So if you need to do that, then I would suggest going down the vector and the RAG retrieval route. And there are several different ways to go about this. I briefly describe a number that I'm aware of. One is that if you're sat and you're happy using OpenAI, then with the OpenAI Responses API, they've made it very easy to use file search. You can basically upload PDFs to your OpenAI account, and then, in fact, let me just show you. Once they're uploaded, you can upload multiple PDFs into a vector store, and then you just pass in the vector store ID. And OpenAI is doing all of the document parsing, all of the chunking. They're just doing that behind the scenes for you. And it means that you don't have to supply hundreds of tutorials. If you want to get a response about a particular tutorial, it's going to use semantic search, which means that it's not a keyword search. Keyword search is basically looking for certain characters or very similar words, whereas semantic search is going to be looking for meaning. So for example, if you wrote a blog post about cake, but you never mentioned the word bake, if you were then to do a vector search for the word bake, it knows that cake and bake, not just, poor example because the words are very similar, but ignore the fact that they're spelled similar, that they are similar in meaning or association within a language, it's going to likely return your article about cake if the user searches for bake. So this is one way of bringing your costs down. If you need to kind of partition up the knowledge base. For example, if each of your users is building their own knowledge base, then the way that people have been doing that for some years now is to use Pinecone, because you can have, I think they call them workspaces. So each of your users can have a workspace ID, and then you can basically restrict your search to a particular workspace. Pinecone's API has come on a lot recently. I've been meaning to do a video on Pinecone, but it's effectively a more, you're getting your hands dirty a bit more compared to using OpenAI's file search. So the way that we work at Planet No Code is that we're using Xano, because Xano's a great platform for big databases and performance, and we're storing all of our transcripts there. We are using Xano to do a vector search. Then we are effectively returning X number of the most relevant transcripts, or actually we've optimized the transcripts. We've got a new data kind of column in our table. I call it chunk. So I take our transcript and I optimize it for RAG retrieval. I have a prompt that basically says, optimize this for questions asked on these topics, return up to 500 tokens, something like that, because there's some kind of optimization that you can do with embeddings. And then we insert that in. So we're not using file search. We're just going to insert it in the user's input, so that we're saying, consider all of this data retrieved from our knowledge base composed to be an answer to our users recommending the most helpful videos and an answer to their query. What often gets banded around, and I'm not an expert on this, is fine-tuning. Often when people talk about custom training data or knowledge bases, the first thing they go to is fine-tuning. And that is what was needed two or more years ago. And I don't think it's so essential now. Fine-tuning is effectively saying, I want my AI to respond in a very prescriptive way, so much so that I'm going to provide it with 100 examples of the sort of ways I want it to respond. I simply don't think that with context windows having got much larger and the intelligence of the models having got so much better, I think that you can do this by describing the role and the tone and basically the scope of what the AI should respond with and shouldn't. I think all of that can go into your system, your developer instruction part of your API call now, because fine-tuning kind of at its core is limited to very particular models. So you'll find that you won't be able to use the latest models. It's a very intensive process. It's a very kind of trial and error process. You're kind of dealing with big CSVs, or I believe some sort of like JSON file, and I just don't think it's needed. So recap, can it and does it make sense cost wise and output wise to go in the instruction developer system prompt? If you know that you've got a big database and you want to cut down on cost, then go down the file search, the RAG, the vector database route. And to be honest, I've never really dealt with fine-tuning. I've worked with a couple of people who have arrived at fine-tuning, but that's because I don't think they've really grasped that it makes sense to go instruction, file search, RAG, vector, and then fine-tuning. Now, if you've got any experience with this, please do share it down in the comments. And as always, we're here to help and support the Bubble No Code App Builder community. And you can do more to reach out to us by heading over to the website.